If you spend enough time around a toddler, you are eventually going to get hit with the absolute most terrifying question in the universe.
Oh yeah, they are notorious for that.
Right. And it's not why is the sky blue, and it's not where you babies come from. It's when they look at you completely serious with those big unblinking eyes and they just ask, "Who am I?"
Yeah, that is, I mean, it is the ultimate conversation stopper. You just freeze.
Completely freeze.
Because suddenly you realize you have absolutely no idea what to say to this tiny human.
Exactly, because on the surface, it feels like the simplest question a child could possibly ask. You just want to say, well, you are Tommy. But then Tommy tilts his head and goes, but what is a Tommy?
And you're just trapped.
Yeah, suddenly you're spiraling. You're looking
Yeah.
down at your own hands, like wiggling your fingers, wondering who is actually driving the spaceship. I mean, it is a question that the absolute most brilliant geniuses in history have been trying to answer for literally thousands of years. And today, that is exactly what we are going to dive into.
It really is the ultimate puzzle. Because every ethical system we have, every rule about how we should treat each other, every political theory about freedom or society, it all rests on some invisible foundational answer to that one really simple question. What is a self?
Because if we don't know what we are...
Exactly. How can we possibly know what we are supposed to do?
So true. And today, our mission is to basically act as your shortcut to 2,500 years of human thought on this exact topic. We've got this incredible source material to guide us today.
Yeah, it's a really fantastic text.
It really is. It's this fascinating academic survey called Who Am I? The Question of Selfhood in the History of Philosophy. And it was prepared for Dr. Jaswant Rathod at the Government Arts College in Gandhinagar. And let me tell you, this paper is just an absolute goldmine.
It's incredibly comprehensive.
Yeah, it traces this massive, heavy question across Greek, Indian, Chinese, and European history.
It is a remarkable synthesis, honestly. What makes this specific survey so compelling to me is that it doesn't just try to, hand you one single correct answer.
Right, like a textbook would.
Yeah, exactly. It treats the centuries of fierce disagreement among all these great thinkers as the actual lesson. The self isn't just a hidden treasure chest waiting to be dug up in the backyard.
Which would be so much easier.
It would be. But no, it's a problem that every single generation has to solve all over again. And usually they solve it based on whatever they most worried about at the time.
And the best part is, for this deep dive, we are going to skip all the dense academic jargon right from the jump.
Highly requested, by the way.
Oh, absolutely. The directive here is very simple language. We are breaking this down into plain, easy-to-digest ideas. No complicated Latin phrases unless we immediately translate them into everyday English.
That's a great rule.
Right. So if you look at all these different answers from the past 2.5 millennia, they basically fall into 4 broad camps.
Right.
First, we have the people who think the self is a thing, like a solid rock or a soul. Second, we have the people who think it's a process, like a flowing river.
Right. Constantly changing.
Exactly. Then third, there's the view that the self is a web, meaning you are just the sum of your relationships. And finally, the DIY project camp who say you aren't born with a self at all and you just have to build it from scratch.
That is just a perfect map of the territory. Those 4 concepts, the thing, the process, the web, and the DIY project, those are essentially the lenses through which humanity has tried to understand its own reflection.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to figure out who we are today, we kind of have to start where Western philosophy basically started. We have to go back to ancient Greece.
Always back to ancient Greece.
Always. Where the smartest guys in the room were absolutely convinced that the self was a hidden, unchanging thing buried deep inside of us.
Yeah, the Western tradition really kicks off with this ancient Greek phrase that was actually carved into the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. It just said, "Know thyself."
Which sounds like a bumper sticker today.
It does, yeah. But Socrates took that carving and made it his entire life's mission. And we really have to understand the context here. Socrates lived in a time when Athens was becoming very wealthy, very focused on status, politics, and material goods.
So people were basically defining themselves by what they owned or who they knew.
Exactly. Very much so.
Ancient influencers.
That is the perfect way to put it. Ancient influencers.
Yeah.
And Socrates just walks into the middle of this and says, you guys have it all wrong. For him, the self was not your bank account. It was not your physical body.
Not your follower count.
Right, not your reputation either. The self was your rational soul. It was this invisible part of you that makes moral choices and uses logic.
He famously said that an unexamined life is not worth living, right? Which honestly sounds a little harsh if you just want to sit on the couch and watch a movie after a long day of work.
Oh, he was incredibly intense about it, asking, "Who am I?" Wasn't just some fun thought experiment to pass the time on a rainy afternoon for him. It was a strict, urgent moral demand.
Like a life or death thing.
Basically, yeah. He believed that if you truly knew yourself, you would figure out the difference between what you just blindly assume is true and what you actually know for a fact. And by doing that rigorous cross-examination of your own brain, you are taking care of your soul. He actually went around the marketplace in Athens, harassing people, telling them to stop caring about their property and start caring about improving their souls.
He was literally the ancient world's most annoying yet brilliant life coach.
He really was.
He would just grill people relentlessly until they realized they didn't know who they were at all. And then his student, Plato, comes along. And Plato takes this idea of the soul and builds this massive, detailed architecture around it.
Plato is all about structure. So in his famous work, The Republic, he said the human mind is divided into three parts. He used the analogy of a chariot. But for today, we can think of it like the crew on a spaceship.
Oh, I like that. A spaceship crew.
Right. So you have the appetite part.
Yeah.
It's the crew member that just wants food, drink, comfort, and immediate gratification.
The one hanging out in the cafeteria.
Exactly. Then you have the spirit part. That's the security officer. The part that seeks honor, gets angry, feels passionate emotions. And then finally, you have the reason part, the thinker, the captain of the ship.
And for Plato, the true you is just that reasoning captain, right? Not the other two.
That is the core of it, yeah.
Mm.
For Plato, a good, healthy life is when the reasoning captain is firmly in charge, keeping the appetites and the spirit in line.
So no mutinies allowed.
No mutinies. But he took it even further into the metaphysical realm. He argued that this reasoning part, this rational soul, is actually immortal. It existed before you were ever born into your current body, and it will survive long after your physical body dies.
So wait, Plato essentially thinks the self is like a little immortal, rational driver sitting inside the meat suit of our physical bodies, holding a steering wheel.
That captures his view perfectly. The driver in the meat suit. The body is almost treated like a nuisance in his philosophy.
Just a heavy vehicle.
Yeah, it gets sick, it gets hungry, it needs sleep, it distracts the driver. The true self is that reasoning driver, temporarily trapped inside this clumsy biological machine, just waiting to be released back into the realm of pure ideas.
See, I have to challenge that, or at least question if it holds up to our daily reality.
Go for it.
Because if the true me is just this pristine, immortal driver, what happens to that driver when I fall asleep? Or like, what if I hit my head and lose my memory? What if my blood sugar drops and I get incredibly cranky?
Angry, basically.
Right. It feels like treating the body as just a temporary meat suit completely ignores how much our physical biology dictates how we think and who we actually are.
You know, you've hit on the exact frustration that drove Plato's own student, Aristotle, to break away from him.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Aristotle looked at Plato's idea of a floating immortal soul trapped in a body and essentially said, "This doesn't make any sense. We are not just ghosts driving meat suits." He brought the whole conversation right back down to earth.
Okay, so if we aren't ghosts driving meat suits, what was Aristotle's take on the self?
Aristotle argued that we are rational animals, sure, but crucially, he added that we are social animals. For him, the self is firmly planted in the physical, messy world and in our daily actions. He said that human flourishing, becoming your best self, is about exercising your reasoning skills over the course of a complete lived life. It's about building habits.
So it's less about floating in the clouds before you were born and more about what you actually choose to do on, like, a random Tuesday.
Precisely. Think about how modern psychology talks about neuroplasticity, the idea that your brain literally rewires itself based on what you do repeatedly.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Aristotle was saying something very similar thousands of years ago. You don't just have a self, you become yourself by practicing virtues. If you want to be a brave person, you don't just sit in a room and think abstractly about bravery.
You actually have to go do brave things.
Exactly. You have to practice doing brave things until it just becomes a habit.
So the action creates the identity.
Yes. And he famously said that humans are naturally suited to live in a community. You cannot reach your full potential living alone on a mountaintop. Your identity is deeply tied to your habits, your virtues, and how you participate in a shared society. You are defined by practice.
So we basically have the ancient Greeks giving us the self as a rational thing, either an immortal soul trapped in a body or a set of habits built in a community.
Right.
But as we follow the timeline in Dr. Rathod's source material, we meet a guy who completely shifts the direction humanity was looking. St. Augustine.
Yes, Augustine.
We're talking hundreds of years later here, right at the end of the ancient world as the Roman Empire is changing.
Augustine brings something total revolutionary to the table, which is the invention of the inner world.
The inner world.
Yeah. Before Augustine, a lot of philosophy was about looking outward at the cosmos, or looking at how you behave in public, like Aristotle did. But Augustine takes the spotlight and turns it entirely inward. In his book, Confessions, he isn't just analyzing his public behavior. He is digging deep into his own private memory, his secret desires, his hidden anxieties.
The text mentions he famously said he had become a question to himself, which is just, a brilliant poetic way of saying, I am having a massive identity crisis.
He really was. He was torn between his physical desires and his spiritual aspirations. But he turned inward for a very specific reason. Augustine believed that if you look deep enough into your own private consciousness way past the distractions of the physical world, you will eventually find a direct connection to God.
Oh, okay.
He believed the human mind was built in the image of the divine. So discovering your true self wasn't just a logic puzzle. It was a deeply emotional, intimate journey into the depths of your own mind.
So he practically invented the idea of having a deep, private inner life.
He really did.
Which sets the stage perfectly for the philosopher who takes this idea of the self as a hidden thing to its absolute logical extreme, René Descartes.
Oh, Descartes. He is the ultimate skeptic. So we've moved into the 1600s now. Europe is going through the scientific revolution. The old medieval worldview is completely collapsing.
Everything is being questioned.
Everything. So Descartes desperately wanted to find just one single piece of knowledge that was absolutely 100% certain, a rock-solid foundation he could build on. So he decided to play a game of radical doubt. He decided to doubt absolutely everything.
And he really committed to it. He doubted that the world outside his window was real. He doubted math.
He did.
He even suggested that maybe an evil demon was tricking him and his own physical hands and body were just an illusion. Which is terrifying, by the way. Imagine sitting alone in your room, looking at the fire, and convincing yourself that absolutely nothing around you actually exists.
It's the original Matrix scenario, centuries before the movie even came out.
Yeah.
But right when he thinks he has destroyed all reality, he hits a wall. There is one single thing he realizes he cannot possibly doubt.
The fact that he's doubting in the first place.
Exactly. He realizes that even if everything is a complete illusion, the very act of doubting means something is doing the doubting. If he is being tricked by a demon, there has to be a him there to be tricked.
Right.
This leads to the absolute most famous quote in all of philosophy. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am.
Let's translate that into the simplest possible terms, because sometimes it can sound like a riddle.
Sure.
If I am asking the question, do I exist? There must be an I right there in the room asking the question. You cannot have a thought without a thinker. The thought itself proves the thinker is real.
That's the mechanism, precisely. And from that one tiny realization, Descartes built his entire view of the self. He concluded that since the only thing he knew for absolute certainty was his thinking mind, and he could still theoretically doubt that his physical body existed.
Right, because of the demon.
Right, then the mind and the body must be two completely fundamentally different things.
This is the famous mind-body dualism.
Yes, Descartes treated the mind and the body like two completely different ingredients that just do not mix, like oil and water. The mind is a thinking thing. It has no physical shape, it has no weight, it doesn't take up space in a room.
Like a ghost.
Basically.
Mm-hmm.
And the body, on the other hand, is an extended thing. It's a physical machine made of meat, blood, and bone that operates strictly on the laws of physics, and they just happen to be temporarily glued together.
Okay.
So for Descartes, the answer to who am I is, I am essentially entirely an invisible thinking thing. The physical body is just an accessory.
We are right back to Plato's driver in the meat suit, just a more updated, scientific-sounding 17th century meat suit.
Pretty much.
But this brings me right back to my earlier pushback, because Descartes says the mind and body are oil and water. They don't share any properties. But if I drink 3 cups of strong espresso, my physical, biological body gets jittery, and suddenly my invisible thinking thing mind starts racing and having anxious thoughts.
Yeah.
If they are completely separate substances, how does the physical coffee in the meat suit affect the invisible, non-physical driver?
That is the million-dollar question. It's called the interaction problem. And it is the exact issue that has haunted Western philosophy and neuroscience ever since Descartes wrote those words.
So he didn't have a good answer.
Not really. If the self is this invisible thinking thing hidden somewhere inside the brain, what is the bridge between the physical chemistry of caffeine and the invisible feeling of anxiety? Descartes thought maybe they connected in the pineal gland, but that didn't solve the physics problem of how the invisible actually moves the visible.
It just seems like a massive amount of stress trying to find this hidden object inside ourselves. But here is where the source material gets really, really interesting.
Oh, this is the big pivot.
Yeah, because while the Europeans were agonizing over this hidden driver and how it connects to the steering wheel, ancient Indian philosophers were looking at the exact same human mind and coming to completely opposite conclusions.
The contrast is truly stunning. If the Greeks and Descartes were obsessed with figuring out what kind of isolated individual object the self is, the ancient Indian traditions looked inward and blew the boundaries of the self completely wide open.
So let's look at the Upanishads first. These are ancient Indian texts, written over several centuries, long before Descartes, and they ask this massive question: what is the one thing you can know that makes you understand everything else?
And their answer is just mind-bending. It requires a total shift in perspective.
Walk us through it.
So, in the Upanishads, the deepest, truest version of the self is called the Atman. But the twist is that the Atman is not your physical body. It is not your mind. It is not even your ego or your personal, all the things you usually think of as you. The Atman is actually identical to Brahman, which is the absolute foundational reality of the entire universe.
Okay, let's translate this into a really simple image. It's the idea that you are not a single, isolated drop of water. You are the entire ocean, temporarily thinking that it's a single drop.
That analogy captures the essence perfectly. The text mentions a very famous phrase from the Chandogya Upanishad, Tat Svamasi, thou art that. Or, in modern English, you are that.
You are the ocean.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It means that this feeling you have right now, that you are a separate, bounded person sitting in a specific chair, totally separate from the trees outside or the stars in the sky, that feeling of separation is a complete illusion.
It's basically a trick of the mind, ignorance.
Yes, the Sanskrit term they use is avidya, or ignorance. Later on, a brilliant thinker named Shankara built an entire philosophical system around this called Advaita Vedanta, which translates to non-dual, meaning not two.
There's no me in you, just us.
Exactly. There is no separation. Liberation, or true freedom, comes when you finally wake up and realize that the sharp line you drew between you and the rest of the universe was drawn in pencil, and it can just be erased. There is no separate I to protect or worry about.
Think about the psychological relief in that. It's like they solved the agonizing problem of the self by inflating you like a balloon until you are literally the size of the whole universe. If you are everything, there's no more puzzle to solve. There's nothing to be afraid of.
It's a very peaceful conclusion.
But right around the same time, in ancient India, the Buddha comes along and takes the exact opposite approach, doesn't he?
He does, and this is one of the most fascinating plot twists in the history of ideas. The Buddha is in the same intellectual neighborhood, exploring the same mysteries of the mind and suffering. But he comes to a conclusion that completely inverts the Upanishads.
He introduces the concept of anatta, no self.
Correct. The Buddha looked inward, just like Augustine or Descartes did centuries later. But when he searched his own mind for that permanent, unchanging soul, that hidden thing running the show, he said, I do not see anything there. He found absolutely no permanent self at all.
Wait, really? Nothing at all? So if there is no self, what is typing on my keyboard right now? What is eating my lunch? Who is feeling stressed about paying the bills?
Well, the Buddha argued that what we lazily call a person is actually just a temporary bundle of 5 moving parts. He called them the 5 aggregates.
Okay, what are the parts?
They are form, which is your physical body, sensation, your raw feelings, perception, how you recognize and label things, mental formations, which are your habits and reactions, and consciousness, your general awareness.
So it's just a bunch of gears spinning together, but there's no mechanic operating them.
Right. And those gears are constantly changing shape and speed. None of those 5 parts are permanent. They're constantly arising and passing away from millisecond to millisecond. They depend entirely on cause and effect.
I really love the analogies the text uses for this. It mentions a flame being passed from one candle to another.
Yes, the candle analogy is great.
If I take a lit candle and use it to light a second candle, is it the exact same flame? It's connected, sure. One caused the other, but it is not a solid, unchanging object that physically jumped across the gap.
Exactly.
Or the other analogy, stepping into a river. The water is constantly flowing and changing. The river I step into today is made of completely different water molecules than the river I stepped into yesterday, even if we still paint the words the Mississippi on a map.
The river analogy is absolutely vital here. The Buddha is saying that you are just a flowing river of thoughts, feelings, and physical matter. You are process, not a solid rock.
Right, the second camp from our outline, the process.
Exactly. And he argued that almost all of our human suffering comes from trying to treat this flowing river like it is a solid rock. We desperately cling to our identities, our youth, our opinions, and our status.
Because we think they're permanent.
Yes. And we suffer when they inevitably change because we expected them to be permanent. True freedom, for the Buddha, is realizing that the permanent self was an illusion all along. When you stop trying to protect a self that isn't actually there, the suffering stops.
That is just brilliant. To use plain English, the Hindi texts solve the problem of the self by expanding you until you are the universe, so there's nothing to fight. And the Buddha solves the problem by shrinking you down until the idea of a fixed self just pops and vanishes completely, so there's nothing left to get hurt.
That's a fantastic summary. Both agree that the way we normally walk around feeling like an isolated little ego is completely wrong.
And we can't leave the Indian traditions without looking at one more hugely influential text mentioned in the source, the Bhagavad Gita.
Oh, yes.
This text offers a perspective that kind of bridges the physical life and the eternal. It focuses on the embodied self, or jiva.
Right, so this is the famous conversation between the warrior Arjuna and his charioteer, who is actually the god Krishna in disguise.
Right, on the battlefield.
Yes. Arjuna is standing on the battlefield, facing a terrible civil war. He looks across the field and sees his own relatives and teachers on the other side. He is paralyzed by the thought of death, killing, and the karmic consequences of his actions.
It freezes up.
Totally freezes. So Krishna has to explain the nature of reality to get him to act. He tells Arjuna that the true self is completely distinct from the fragile physical body. He says the self cannot be burned by fire, it cannot be cut by swords, it cannot be made wet by water or dry by the wind. It is an eternal witness.
And the analogy Krishna uses here is about changing clothes, right?
It's a very comforting metaphor, actually.
Yeah.
Krishna says that just as a person takes off worn-out old clothes at the end of the day and puts on new ones, the eternal self simply sheds an old, worn-out body at death and takes on a new one.
Wow.
So the true self is this silent, untouched witness that just rides along while the physical body goes through the messy transformations of life, aging, and death. Your duty is to act in the physical world without being emotionally attached to the results, because the true self is never really harmed.
It is wild how many different ways humans have tried to solve this single question. I mean, we've got immortal drivers in meat suits, drops in the ocean, flowing rivers of thought, and eternal witnesses changing clothes.
It's a very crowded room of ideas.
It really is. But let's jump back to Europe for a minute, because if the Buddha says we are just a flowing river of changing experiences hundreds of years later, a group of British thinkers essentially said the exact same thing. But they ran into a very practical, everyday problem.
Right. The problem of continuity.
Exactly, because if I am just a constantly changing river of thoughts, how do I remember my own name? How do I know I'm the same person who went to sleep in this bed last night?
So now we are moving into the era of the empiricists. These were philosophers in the 17th and 18th centuries who believed that all knowledge has to come from our actual sensory experience.
Like what we can touch and see.
Exactly. What we can see, hear, touch, and remember. They didn't want to rely on invisible metaphysical concepts anymore. And the first major figure here is John Locke.
And Locke looks at Descartes' idea of a magical, invisible thinking substance and basically says, nah, I don't buy it, I can't see it or measure it.
Locke completely rejects the idea of a hidden soul substance as the basis of identity. He says, let's be practical. Personal identity isn't about some invisible spiritual object. It is entirely about psychological continuity.
Okay, what does psychological continuity actually mean for a normal person going about their day?
It means memory. Locke argued that what makes you you today and what makes you the exact same person that existed 10 years ago is simply the fact that your current consciousness is connected to your past experiences through a chain of memory.
Okay, so the memory is the glue.
Exactly. If you can remember being that 7-year-old child scraping their knee, you are that person. The memory is the glue.
So the glue holding me together isn't a soul, it's just my memories. The text brings up this wild thought experiment Locke used called the Prince and the Cobbler. Walk us through that, because it's pretty fun.
It's essentially the philosophical blueprint for every body swap movie ever made, like Freaky Friday.
Love that movie.
Right. So Locke said, imagine you take the mind, the consciousness, and all the memories of a wealthy, educated prince, and you magically transfer all of that into the physical brain and body of a lowly, uneducated cobbler.
Okay.
When that body wakes up the next morning, who is it?
Well, I mean, if I wake up in someone else's body, but I remember my entire life growing up in a castle, eating banquets, and ruling a country, I am still the prince. I am just going to be really confused about why my hands are suddenly calloused and my bedroom smells like shoe leather.
And Locke says almost everyone would agree with you. The person waking up is the prince, just in a new physical location. Therefore, Locke concludes, identity has absolutely nothing to do with your physical body, and it has nothing to do with an invisible soul. It is entirely located in the unbroken chain of your conscious memories. Where the memory goes, the self goes.
Okay, I have to push back on Locke here because the real-world implications of this are massive.
They definitely are.
Let's say Locke is right, and I am literally nothing more than the sum of my memories. What if I go to a party, drink way too much, and completely black out and I do something terrible? Or, on a more tragic note, what if someone develops severe Alzheimer's and loses decades of their memory?
Right.
If the chain of memory is broken, does Locke think I literally become a different person? Do I stop existing?
You've zeroed in on the absolute most famous and devastating criticism of Locke's theory. Because if memory is the only thing that makes you you, then technically the person who committed a crime during a blackout is not the same person who wakes up the next morning with a hangover and no memory of it.
Wow.
This caused a massive debate in ethics and law. If you don't remember committing a crime, can a judge ethically punish you for it? Are they punishing an innocent person?
That sounds like a terrible legal defense. Your Honor, I don't remember robbing the bank, so technically a completely different guy did it. You can't send me to jail.
It doesn't really hold up in court.
No. It feels like Locke's theory breaks down when it hits the messy reality of human biology. But then we get to David Hume, who takes Locke's ideas, looks at the Buddha's flowing river, and pushes the whole thing to the absolute breaking point.
Hume is fantastic because he is brutally, almost uncomfortably honest about his own experience. He says, okay, everyone keeps talking about this solid thing called the self. Let me just close my eyes, sit quietly, and look really, really closely inside my own head to see if I can actually find it.
And what happens when he looks?
He finds nothing resembling a solid self. He says that whenever he looks inside, he never catches an eye. All he finds are specific, fleeting feelings and perceptions.
Like what?
He finds a feeling of coldness, then a feeling of hunger, then a feeling of love or sadness or sudden memory of a face. But he never ever finds an independent self that is separate from those passing feelings.
So, to use a modern analogy, is he saying the mind is basically like a smartphone screen? You have all these apps opening and closing in rapid succession, that the sadness app opens for a minute, then the hunger app, then the warmth app. But Hume is saying there is no actual physical phone holding it all together. It's just the apps floating in empty space, replacing each other.
That is an incredibly accurate way to visualize it. Hume famously called the self a bundle of perceptions. He said we are just a collection of experiences firing off with inconceivable speed in a perpetual state of movement and flux.
So why do we feel like one person?
He said we only think we have a unified, solid self because our imagination plays a trick on us. We experience things so fast, one right after another, that our brain invents a fictional self just to make it all seem organized.
So the self is just a convenient fiction, a grammatical habit that is so similar to the Buddha's idea of the flowing river.
It really is.
But here's my issue with Hume. If we are just a chaotic bundle of apps opening and closing, a stream of random sensory data, how do we ever make sense of the world? Why isn't my life just a blurry, confusing mess? That brings us to Immanuel Kant, doesn't it?
It does. Kant reads Hume, and he is deeply unsettled by it. Kant essentially says, okay, Hume, you make a fair point. We cannot find a solid object called the self when we look inward. But you went way too far.
He threw the baby out with the bathwater.
Exactly. Kant argued that if our minds were truly just a chaotic, unorganized bundle of random feelings, hot, sad, loud, bright, hungry, our experience of reality would just be pure static noise.
It would be like trying to watch 10 different TV channels at the exact same time while listening to the radio.
Precisely. So Kant says there must be some kind of underlying logical structure, some mental glue that organizes all this chaotic sensory data into a coherent, unified picture. The academic term he gives this in the text is the transcendental unity of apperception.
Whoa, okay, red alert, stop right there. Transcendental unity of apperception. We promise simple language. What is this mental glue? Translate that for me.
Fair enough. That is peak academic jargon. Let's go right back to your smartphone analogy. If Hume says you're just a bunch of chaotic apps opening and closing, Kant is stepping in to say, wait a minute, apps can't just float in thin air. There has to be an operating system.
Like iOS or Android.
Exactly. I mean, yes, that's the perfect translation. The self isn't an app you can click on and look at. You can't see the operating system running. It's invisible.
Right.
The self is the operating system running quietly in the background, synthesizing all the data, making sure the camera app and the map app don't crash into each other. It's the background framework that makes experience possible.
I love that. I'm not an object I can find. I am the background condition that makes it possible to have experiences in the first place. Without the operating system, the phone is just a useless brick of glass. Kant basically rescues the self by making it the ultimate behind-the-scenes manager.
He does. Kant says you cannot directly experience the self, but logically you have to assume the operating system is there, otherwise the coherent world we experience makes zero sense.
Okay, so up to this point, we have been on this massive journey. We've talked to Descartes, the Buddha, Locke, Hume, Kant, but they all share one major foundational assumption. They are all looking inside the individual's head.
Yes, very inward focused.
They are staring at their own mental belly buttons, trying to figure out how the mind works in isolation. But what if looking inward is the wrong direction entirely? What if the self only exists between people?
Now we're entering the third camp we outlined at the beginning, the view of the self as a web.
The web.
This is the idea that your identity is entirely social and relational. And to really understand this paradigm shift, the text takes us back to ancient China, to the philosophy of Confucius.
Now, Confucius has a totally different vibe than the Greeks or the Enlightenment thinkers. He is not talking about immortal souls or bundles of perception or operating systems.
Not at all. For Confucius, the very idea of an isolated, self-sufficient individual sitting alone in a room thinking, I think, therefore I am, is basically nonsense.
Like a fantasy?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a fantasy. You don't exist in a vacuum. You only become a self through your relationships with other people.
So the web.
The web. He focused heavily on specific relationships, parent and child, ruler and subject, friend and friend, husband and wife. His argument is that you aren't a generic, pre-packaged human who later goes out into the world and decides to make friends. You become a person by being a good friend. You construct your identity by honoring your parents and participating in the rituals of society.
Let me pose a thought experiment to test this.
Go ahead.
If I am in a terrible shipwreck and I get stranded completely alone on a desert island, like Tom Hanks in Castaway, do I literally lose myself in the Confucian view? Because there's no one around for me to be a friend to, no one to be a son to, no society to participate in.
Under a strict interpretation of the web view, yes, your humanity begins to dissolve. Think of a fishing net. A single knot in a fishing net has no purpose, no function, and really no identity without all the other strings pulling on it to give it tension. If you take a pair of scissors, cut the knot out, and isolate it, it's just a useless, frayed piece of string. For Confucius, your identity is the sum of your duties, your rituals, and your connections to others. Without the net, the knot is nothing.
That is a beautiful but also kind of terrifying way to look at it. You are literally built out of other people.
Yeah.
And this idea of the social web pops up again in Europe much later with a German philosopher named Hegel, right?
Yes, Hegel takes this idea of the social web and adds a layer of intense psychological drama to it. He argued that you cannot truly become self-conscious all by yourself. You can't just look in a mirror. You need another independent consciousness to look at you and recognize you.
You need a living mirror.
Yes, exactly. And this leads to his incredibly famous concept called the master-slave dialectic. Hegel says that when two human consciousnesses meet for the first time, it's not just a polite handshake.
What is it?
There is a deep psychological struggle for recognition. Each person wants the other to acknowledge them as a free, independent self. It is a battle to be seen and validated.
Wow.
Hegel argued that human history is basically driven by this deep, agonizing need for mutual recognition. You only know who you are when you see yourself reflected in the eyes of another person who respects you.
It's the ultimate validation check. You see echoes of this today with social media. People post photos of their lives hoping for likes and comments. They are literally begging the digital web to recognize them, to validate that their experience is real.
Absolutely.
And if we take this idea that we are defined by the world outside our heads, the text brings up Karl Marx, who takes Hegel's theories and grounds them in cold, hard economics.
Marx takes Hegel's ideas about history and the struggle for recognition, but he applies them directly to the harsh physical reality of economics, factories, and jobs.
Now, just framing this academically for our listeners, we are looking purely at the philosophical and economic lens Dr. Rathard's text provides. Regardless of modern politics, Marx's view on how labor shapes identity is a fascinating piece of the historical puzzle, and we're not taking sides here.
It absolutely is. And yes, purely from a historical perspective, Marx's core argument is about material reality. He completely flipped the script on the thinkers who came before him. He said that it is not your internal consciousness that determines your social life. It is your social and economic life that determines your consciousness.
So your job, your class, and how you put food on the table literally build your sense of self.
Yes. Marx believed that humans naturally express themselves and build their identities by creatively making things what he called our species being. If you build a chair from scratch, you see your own creativity reflected in that chair. But under capitalism, he argued, a worker is put on an assembly line.
Or in a modern context, working in a massive e-commerce warehouse or doing gig economy deliveries.
Exactly. You do a repetitive task all day to make a tiny part of a machine or move a box for a company you will never own, to enrich a boss you rarely see.
This introduces his concept of alienation.
Yes. Marx says that in this system, you become alienated or psychologically disconnected from the product you're making. You are alienated from your own creative potential because your labor is just a commodity to be bought and sold.
That's depressing.
It gets worse. Tragically, you become alienated from your fellow workers, whom you now see as competitors for wages instead of friends in the web. You become a replaceable cog in a machine.
So if you ask, who am I under this system, what's his answer?
Marx would say the honest answer is that you are an alienated product of your economic environment. You cannot find your true liberated self just by meditating or doing introspective journaling. You have to physically change the material world you live in.
It is a totally external view of the self. Descartes says, close your eyes, sit by the fire, and think. Marx says, open your eyes and look at the factory you work in, because the factory is building your brain.
That's a great contrast.
But if society, our parents, our relationships, and our jobs define who we are, doesn't that mean we are just trapped? If I'm just a product on an assembly line or a knot in a net, where's my freedom?
And that suffocating feeling of being trapped by society is exactly what triggers the fourth and final camp in our source material, the rebels.
Yeah, here we go.
The philosophers who looked at the web and said, no, you are not just a product of society. The self is a DIY project. You are not born with it. You have to build it yourself.
The existentialists.
Starting in the 19th century. And the loudest, most aggressive voice in this rebellion is Friedrich Nietzsche.
Nietzsche is the guy who looks at this idea of a stable, peaceful, rational identity and just pulls the pin on a grenade and throws it into the room.
He really does. Nietzsche hated the idea that we have a nice, polite, rational soul steering the ship. He said that if you look inside, you won't find an unified I. You won't find Plato's rational captain.
What do you find instead?
You will find a chaotic, roaring battleground of different drives, instincts, and desires, all fighting each other for control. He pointed out that the very grammar of our language tricks us. When a thought pops into your head, you say, I think. But Nietzsche says, actually, the thought came when it wanted to, not when you wanted it to.
Oh, that rings so incredibly true. Have you ever tried to sit quietly and meditate, and suddenly you are intensely thinking about a humiliating thing you said at a party in 2012, or a catchy commercial jingle from the 90s?
All the time.
You didn't deliberately choose to think that. It just invaded your brain.
That is the perfect example. So Nietzsche says there is no core you running the show, safely insulated from the chaos. There is just a contest of competing drives expressing what he called a will to power. But instead of getting depressed or nihilistic about this internal chaos, Nietzsche says you should view it as an opportunity for supreme art.
The DIY project.
Yes. His most famous instruction is, become who you are. Which sounds like a paradox.
Yeah, how can you become what you already are?
What he means is you have to take that chaotic mess of instincts and creatively, forcefully impose order upon it. You have to act like a master sculptor shaping raw clay. You overcome the boring, safe values that society and religion handed down to you, and you forge your own masterpiece.
So the self isn't a treasure hiding under a rock waiting to be found. It is a sword you have to hammer out on an anvil yourself.
I like that.
And another philosopher swinging a hammer during this time was Søren Kierkegaard.
Yes, Kierkegaard was a Danish philosopher, and he approached this DIY project from a deeply personal, religious angle. He looked at the giant, impersonal, historical systems of guys like Hegel and felt sick. He said, look, I am a single individual human being, sweating and anxious, trying to figure out how to live my actual life. For Kierkegaard, the self is not a noun, it is a verb. It is a task you have to complete.
The text mentions he called it a synthesis.
Yes, a synthesis between the finite meaning, the everyday boring world of paying bills, going to work, and eating dinner, and the infinite, the eternal possibilities of existence. And he said this synthesis doesn't just naturally happen on its own. You have to actively, consciously choose it. If you avoid making a real choice, you fall into a state of despair.
And his solution to escaping that despair is his famous concept, the leap of faith.
Correct. Kierkegaard believed you cannot logic or reason your way into an authentic self. At some point, logic runs out. You have to stand alone in the dark, take a massive risk, and passionately commit to something. For him, it was a deeply personal relationship with God. You forge your identity in the fire of that radical, unjustifiable choice.
So we have Nietzsche saying, build a masterpiece out of chaos, and Kierkegaard saying, take a terrifying leap of faith. This intense focus on individual choice brings us directly into the 20th century with phenomenology and existentialism, and the source text highlights Martin Heidegger.
Heidegger completely changes the vocabulary of philosophy. He says we need to stop asking what the self is, as if it's an object like a coffee mug or a chair. Instead, we should look at the raw, unfiltered experience of existing. He uses a German term, Dasein, which simply translates to being there.
It's just the raw feeling of being here, waking up and experiencing the world.
Right, and Heidegger points out something obvious but profound. We don't start out as blank slate brains floating in jars. We're always already thrown into a world we didn't choose. You're thrown into a specific family, a specific language, a specific economic class, a specific time period.
The concept of thrownness, like I didn't ask to be born in the 21st century. I could have been born a peasant in 14th century France, and myself would be completely different. But here I am dealing with the smartphone era.
And Heidegger says that most of the time, the way we deal with this thrownness is by just blindly following the crowd. He calls this living inauthentically. We do what they do. We talk about what they talk about on the news. We buy what they say is fashionable.
Just blending in.
Exactly. We get completely lost in idle chatter and conformity to avoid the anxiety of standing alone.
We basically run our lives on autopilot. So how do we snap out of it? How do we wake up, according to Heidegger?
We wake up when we realize in our bones that we are going to die.
Well, that took a dark turn.
It sounds morbid, but he actually meant it as a profound awakening. He calls it being toward death.
Yeah.
When you truly, honestly confront the fact that your time on this planet is strictly limited and that absolutely nobody else can die your death for you, suddenly you stop caring about what the crowd thinks.
Because the crowd can't save you.
Right. You snap out of autopilot, you claim your own finite time, and you take authentic ownership of your life.
That makes total intuitive sense. Think about people who have a severe near-death experience or survive a major illness. Almost universally, they quit the boring job they hated, they stop caring about social status, and they start painting or spending time with their kids.
It's a huge catalyst.
Facing the absolute end of the timeline forces you to figure out who you actually want to be today, which leads us perfectly to the absolute rock star of French existentialism, Jean-Paul Sartre.
Sartre takes all of this anxiety, freedom, and choice and distills it into one massive, earth-shattering slogan. Existence precedes essence.
Okay, we need to break that phrase down because the text uses a brilliant analogy here about a paper knife or a letter opener. Let's really walk through that.
Let's do it. Imagine a factory that makes letter openers. Before the metal is ever poured, the designer has an idea in their head of what this object is supposed to be. It needs to have a handle. It needs to be sharp enough to cut paper, but not sharp enough to cut a hand. Its essence, its purpose, its definition comes first. Then it is manufactured and brought into existence.
So for manufactured objects, essence comes before existence. The blueprint exists before the object does.
Yes. And for centuries, religion and philosophy treated humans the exact same way. They thought God, or Mother Nature, designed us with a specific blueprint, a specific human nature, and then we were born. But Sartre looks at humanity and says, no, God is dead. The blueprint is gone. For humans, existence precedes essence.
Meaning we are just violently born to the world first. We just pop into existence, totally blank, with no pre-written purpose, no destiny, and no inherent meaning whatsoever.
Exactly. You exist first. And because there is no blueprint, you are, in his famous and terrifying words, condemned to be free. You are completely 100% responsible for creating your own essence through your daily choices.
Condemned to be free. What a haunting phrase. Because total freedom sounds amazing on paper until you realize it means you have absolutely no excuses left.
That is the terror of it. You cannot blame your genetics. You cannot blame your parents. You cannot blame your boss or society. Every single action you take is a brushstroke, painting the permanent portrait of who you are. If you are a coward, it's because you continually choose to do cowardly things. And if you try to deny this freedom, Sartre says you're living in a state of bad faith.
The text mentions Sartre's famous observation of the waiter in the cafe. Let's expand on that because it's such a relatable concept.
Sartre describes sitting in a Parisian cafe and watching a waiter work. He notices the waiter's movements are a little too precise, a little too eager. He balances his tray with the stiff perfection of a robot. Sartre realizes the man is playing it, being a waiter. He is trying to convince himself that his entire fixed identity is just, I am a waiter, like an object, like a letter opener.
It's like when someone says, I can't help being aggressive, I'm a Scorpio. Or, I can't quit and write a novel, I'm just a corporate accountant. Sartre is saying you are lying to yourself to escape the vertigo of total freedom, right? You are pretending to be an object with a fixed blueprint so you don't have to face the terrifying fact that you can choose to walk out the door and be anything.
That is exactly what bad faith is. To sum up this entire DIY project camp, the existentialists believe you are the sole author of your own book. You might be handed a crappy pen or torn paper or get thrown into a really difficult setting, but you write the words. Nobody else can write it for you.
Being the author of your own book sounds incredibly empowering. It puts you in the driver's seat. But as we enter the final act of our deep dive, Dr. Rathood's source material introduces a group of modern thinkers who throw a massive, heavy wrench into that beautiful idea. Because what if the language you are writing your book in was rigged against you from the very start?
This brings us to the postmodern and postcolonial thinkers of the late 20th century. And their main target is that feeling of total, unburdened freedom that Sartre just tried to give us. They argue that the authentic self is actually a carefully constructed illusion created by invisible systems of power.
We are talking about the French philosopher Michel Foucault here.
Yes, Foucault completely upends the apple cart. He says, look closely at history. Look at modern institutions, prisons, psychiatric hospitals, schools, militaries. These places don't just hold people or teach people. They constantly observe us, they categorize us, they test us, and they measure us against what they have decided is normal.
So a school gives you a standardized grade to tell you how smart you are. A hospital gives you a clinical diagnosis to tell you how sane you are. Society dictates what kind of sexuality is acceptable.
And Foucault argues that these institutions literally mold our inner lives. Through constant discipline and observation, society produces the exact kind of compliant, normal individuals it needs to function. So when you look deep inside yourself, past all the noise, and say, aha, this is my true, authentic inner identity, Foucault would laugh and say, no, that is just the script that the institutions of power implanted in your head. You aren't an independent author. You are a product of power dynamics.
That is incredibly heavy. So before I even open my mouth to declare I am, history, politics, and the people in charge have already filled in the blank for me.
For Foucault, yes. He even suggested that this modern obsession with the individual human self is just a recent historical invention, a temporary phase, and it might eventually get washed away like a face drawn in the sand at the edge of the sea.
And then there is Jacques Derrida, who takes this extreme skepticism and applies it to language itself.
Derrida is famous for the concept of deconstruction. He points out that words only ever have meaning based on what they are not. You only understand the concept of light because you contrast it against dark. You only know inside because of outside. He argues that human identity operates the exact same way.
Always shifting.
Exactly. It is never stable. It is always shifting. You construct your identity by aggressively defining yourself against what you are not, the other, which means your precious identity is basically a fragile house of cards, constantly relying on opposites to stay standing.
a shifting funhouse mirror of language. This idea of identity not being a fixed box actually reminds me of something much earlier in the text. The ancient Taoist philosopher from China, Zhuangzi.
Ah, the butterfly dream. That is a brilliant thematic connection to make.
Yeah, the text mentions this famous ancient story. Zhuangzi falls asleep in the grass and dreams he is a butterfly. And in the dream, he is just fluttering around, completely happy, doing butterfly things with absolutely no memory of being a human man named Zhuangzi. Then he wakes up, looks at his human hands, and has this profound realization.
It's such a great moment.
He says, wait, am I a man who just dreamed he was a butterfly? Or am I actually a butterfly right now, fast asleep, dreaming that I am a man?
It is such a beautiful, disorienting story. Zhuangzi was pointing out that fixed identities, the rigid labels and boxes we cram ourselves into, are just illusions created by our rigid, analytical minds. A wise person doesn't cling to a strict identity. They just flow with the endless transformations of the universe, the Tao.
So whether it is an ancient Chinese Taoist or a 20th century French postmodernist, they're both basically warning us, do not get too attached to the label you slapped on your forehead because it's not as real as you think.
And the final group of thinkers in our source text brings a very urgent, real-world political dimension to this idea of labels, the post-colonial thinkers.
And again, framing this academically for our listeners, we are exploring the philosophical viewpoints presented in the text regarding how historical forces of colonialism physically and psychologically impact identity. Just reporting what the text says.
Right. The text highlights Frantz Fanon, a psychiatrist and philosopher who wrote Black Skin, White Masks. Fanon was exploring the devastating psychological damage of living under colonialism. He pointed out a horrific reality. When colonized people try to look at themselves to find their identity, they often cannot see their own authentic reflection. Instead, they see themselves through the harsh, judging, stereotypical eyes of the colonizers.
So that social mirror Hegel was talking about, the mirror we need to build our identity, has been completely cracked and warped by history.
Exactly. Fanon argued that the colonizer's gaze forces a fixed, negative, inferior identity onto the colonized person from the outside. So the existential question, who am I, isn't something you can freely, joyfully answer in a Parisian cafe like Sartre suggested. The answer is violently imposed on you by a global power structure. Reclaiming your true self requires physically and psychologically breaking that structure.
The text also brings in Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, who asks a really haunting philosophical question.
Spivak focuses on the most marginalized, silenced people in a society, whom she calls the subaltern. Specifically, she looked at colonized women, who face a double oppression from both a foreign colonial system and the local patriarchal structures. Her famous essay asks, can the subaltern speak?
And what does she mean by that in the context of building a self?
She means, is it even possible for the most silenced people in society to articulate their own authentic identity? Or are the dominant systems of language, education, and power so overwhelming that society just ends up speaking over them, or arrogantly speaking for them?
It's like someone trying to shout their own name into a hurricane. Spivak is asking if it's even possible for their true voice to be heard without it being instantly distorted by the people holding the microphones. It makes the question of selfhood not just a fun puzzle to solve in an armchair, but a matter of actual psychological survival and justice.
It grounds the entire abstract conversation in reality. It ties the inner world directly to the historical world.
Okay, we have covered an absolute marathon of human thought today. We have gone from ancient Greece to ancient India to Enlightenment Europe to modern political theory. We've talked about chariots, rivers, knots, operating systems, and paper knives. How do we synthesize all this? How do we wrap up this massive journey through Dr. Rathod's text?
The source text does a phenomenal job of pulling the broad patterns together. Basically, you can view the entire history of philosophy as a giant three-way tug of war over this single question of, who am I?
Let's lay out the three ropes of this tug of war for the listener.
The first tug of war is substance versus process. Are you a thing or are you a river? Plato and Descartes assure you that you have a solid, unchanging, immortal soul or mind. The Buddha and David Hume counter that by saying, no, you are just a rushing, temporary stream of habits and fleeting feelings.
Okay, the second tug of war.
Individual versus relational. Are you built exclusively inside your own head, or are you built in the web of society? Descartes and Locke say you can figure out who you are completely alone in your room by looking at your thoughts and memories. Confucius, Marx, and Foucault say absolutely not. You're built out of your relationships, your economic class, and the power structure surrounding you.
And the final tug-of-war.
Discovered versus created. Do you find yourself or do you build yourself? Augustine says you search inside your memory to discover the pre-existing truth God put there. Sartre and Nietzsche say the canvas is totally blank. You have to pick up the brush and aggressively paint your own identity through your actions.
So what does this all mean for you, listening to this right now? Why should you care what a bunch of guys in togas or 19th century coats thought about the self?
Right.
It matters because the way you ask the question reveals who you are trying to be, and it dictates the solutions you will try when you are suffering. Next time you feel stuck in life, ask yourself, am I frustrated because I am desperately trying to find some unchanging hidden soul that doesn't actually exist? Or am I struggling because I am trying to build a new habit, and building a self is just incredibly hard work?
The philosophy you lean toward completely shapes your reality. Are you trying to be a good friend in the Confucian web? Are you trying to take a Kierkegaardian leap of faith with a career change? Understanding these frameworks gives you a much richer toolkit for understanding your own brain.
It really does. And before we go, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. Something that builds on the text but drags it right into our modern everyday lives.
I love where this usually goes. Lay it on us.
Think about your digital footprint. Your social media profiles, your years of text messages, your thousands of photos, your terrifyingly accurate search history. If John Locke is right, and you are literally just the sum of your memories, and if Confucius is right, and you are defined entirely by your social connections, then is your digital avatar practically a living self on its own? It holds your memories perfectly. It maps your social web exactly. It exists constantly, 24 hours a day, being perceived and judged by others, even while your physical body is asleep.
That is a staggering application of these theories. It makes you wonder,
Right.
when you permanently delete a 10-year-old social media profile, did a very real version of you just cease to exist? Did you just commit digital ego death?
Right. If the self is just a bundle of perceptions, like Hume said, what happens when half of those perceptions live on a server farm in California instead of in your skull? We have gone from Plato's immortal soul as a driver in a meat suit to a digital ghost driving a data suit. The landscape of the self is murkier, stranger, and more exciting than ever.
The question truly is inexhaustible. Every generation will have to answer it again.
And that is the beauty of it. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Dr. Rathard's fascinating survey. We hope this shortcut through 25 centuries of thought helps you the next time you look in the mirror, or the next time a toddler demands to know the secrets of the universe. Keep questioning, keep building, and keep exploring the incredible maze of your own mind. We will see you next time.